Talking about responsive typography techniques, like Snook just said, and it's actually been a really fun day so far. I mean, CSSConf has been pretty cool for a first time around, don't you think? Yeah! So, to start off, thanks so much for you guys for having me. It's been really awesome and it's a big honor to be at the first time of a conference. That's really, really cool. I also appreciate all of you guys letting me talk about typography, because I don't know if you noticed, but we've been talking about a lot of pretty crazy stuff. Pretty serious stuff, and I'm like, let's talk about type. Yay. So, yay, at least one other person. So a couple of things that I do. I am the managing editor of Creative.js, and basically we collect up a bunch of cool tutorials and articles and things about fun stuff people are doing with JavaScript. We also teach some workshops. I teach one of those workshops, obviously the coolest of all the workshops, and that's the Creative.js for designers, because designers are the coolest, obviously. I also run Web Design Day, which is a day kind of like this, except in Pittsburgh, so we don't have any ocean or sun. So anyways, but we do talk about web design and a lot. So I've been running that for a while. Also, I think just like last week, I released, or 5 Simple Steps released, my book, The Pocket Guide to CSS Animations. It has exactly nothing to do with what I'm talking about today. Like, literally nothing at all. There will be no talk of animations, but if you're into those, you might want to check it out. So, yeah. I just realized one thing that is missing, and I'm not sure if I can get it back. Sorry. That's how you can tell I'm Canadian. I just apologized for fixing my screen. Oh, you guys, there's gonna be better jokes than that. Okay, so we've just been talking about things like viewport sizes and checkboxes and all this stuff, and I figured that maybe, you know, to get everyone thinking about type and to get in like a typography kind of mood, we could play a little game. Maybe? Up for it? Okay, good. You guys are a little bit alive. So the game I want to play is called Font or Fish. Basically, oops, well, we already got to the first question. I put a name up on the screen. You tell me if you think it's a font or a fish. So this one? Fish. Yay! Oh, and don't you love these like keynote transitions? Amazing. All right, how about this one? Font. Yes! You guys are a little too good. I should have made these harder. This one? Font. No, it's a fish. Oh. Yay! I stumped you on one, but this is fun, isn't it? How about this one? Fish. Yes, it's a fish. Isn't he cute? Last one? Yes! Awesome! All right, so everyone's about set to start talking about typography, right? Yay! Oh, I'm so glad you guys play my game. That's really cool. All right, so a couple things we have in this talk, well, a list of exactly 4, actually. We're going to talk about, or I'm going to show you 3 approaches for awesomely readable body text in responsive design. I'm going to hopefully prove to you that even just the smallest bit of attention to your type can give you huge, awesome results for your designs. There's going to be one very sad cat, I'm sorry, and any number of terrible jokes. Might be sorry about that too. But really the main thing is there's no one way to do any of this stuff. I'm sharing what works for me and what seems to work for some other people I hang out with as well. But I find that responsive design has really changed my process a lot, and it's very much evolving. So this is the stuff I'm doing now. Maybe I'll come up with a better idea tomorrow. Maybe you guys will come up with a better idea tomorrow. And that's kind of the fun part about sharing. So, oh well, we'll just use this one. Let's start with some science. Bad typography probably never killed anyone. I put probably in just in case there's any like lawyers or fact-checking people in the world. Maybe it has happened, but chances are it hasn't happened very often. You know, but there's also been the worst thing that can probably happen with bad typography is you can look a little bad, maybe you can look a little bit like out of style, a little bit awkward, a little bit ugly, but it's not really going to hurt anything. You know, worst thing, you might look a little below average, but you're not going to be like painfully hurting anyone. There's been some scientific studies even, particularly this one, the aesthetics of reading. It's very tiny on the screen, but whatever. One of the things they proved is that it actually doesn't make a difference if you're reading good typography or bad typography. You still retain the same information. You still read the same speed. So like, Bad typography doesn't slow you down. Good typography doesn't make your job of reading easier. So you're kind of like, all right, well, that's sort of weird. But this same study also proved that, or found that good typography induces a good mood. And that's probably something you've heard quoted before. A lot of type people like to bring it up. But what they found, which I think is really cool, is they gave people something to read. And they had, like, their one section of people read something that was set in bad typography. But they gave them, like, a present first. They're like, here you go. Here's a present. Go read this bad typography. And at the end, those people were in just as good of a mood, or the same good mood, as the people who were given no present but got to read good typography. So the obvious conclusion is good typography is like giving your users a present, right? But I mean, maybe not that literal, but it's actually true. Having good typography puts people in a good mood, makes you look better, and having people in a good mood, having people more, thinking more highly of you is a pretty good thing to gain by good typography. And of course, a little bit of time on typography will give you really, really great results. If you spend even just a few minutes at any point in time in your process, or any point in your process, you'll get some really good results. And it's not something that you even need to be, a typography expert for. Just by paying attention to a few of the things I'll list out, you're going to be so much more awesomer at typography. And that's, awesomer is totally a word. Yeah. But responsive web design has totally changed the way we think about web typography. Suddenly we're doing this thing where we're setting type. That's what you call it, even if it's CSS and stuff, setting type, because we are serious type people as web designers now, even though one day we weren't, but now we are. Yes. Not that I'm scarred by that or anything. So we're suddenly putting type in these containers that can change any size at any time, and we're basically like making our sites and containers do this all the time. And we're going to throw type in there. And we're doing it on purpose. So we used to set up our style rules for type just once, right? We just set them once and be like, we're done. It's a fixed container. It's good. And if we do that now, we just set our styles for text once. The same styles that give us this, which maybe isn't so bad. It's some small text in a small little container. Maybe it's like some sort of mobile-y view or something. But the same styles that give us that give us this on larger screens when it becomes responsive. And this is not okay. This is completely horrible, and no one would ever want to read it. Like, it's impossible to read, even if it wasn't so small. Just having line lengths that long, no one would ever want to read it. And sadly, with responsive design, we've been subjecting to people reading our sites to things very similar to this way more than we should. Not saying anyone in this room has done it, but yeah, you've seen it. You've gone to sites just been like, what is going on? And so we need to stop this on the internet, because in fact, when you put line lengths this long on the internet, it makes the cats behind the internet cry. And we really can't do that. So if nothing else, cats run the internet and long line lengths make them cry. All right, on a roll. So now we've established that, everyone wants to keep their line lengths in check, obviously. Responsive web design, or typography for responsive web design, my titles are getting so long. What kind of goals might that have? If things have changed, we've got these flexible containers, what goals are we going for now? I would suggest that we kind of have two goals: to be consistent in some way, shape, or form, like visually, hopefully, somewhat consistent to help project a consistent message or some crazy idea like that, and also to be easily readable, no matter what size or what sort of situation you're being viewed in. Sounds like a couple pretty good goals. So let's look at how to meet them, because clearly that's where I'm going with a list like this. So what can we do to bring more consistency to our type in responsive web design? The very first thing, the main thing we can do, is to set a scale, because consistency makes you look good. And the first thing everyone says when they talk about a typographic scale is that Robert Brinkhurst said you should use one, right? Of course, totally heard that. And he did. See, it's right there. He totally did say that. But he wrote this book originally like a gajillion years ago in internet time. Why should we listen to this now? So I have an even better reason, and that's the consistency factor. The idea of keeping a consistent look to your type really makes you look way more professional, looks things more planned out and more composed, and that consistency helps carry a similar feel across the board of any sort of size that your type's being viewed at. And it's not like people reading your site are going to be like, looking at this on my phablet, I've noticed that the ratio between the H2 and the H3 is exactly the same as it was on my desktop. But they're never going to say that, because that sounds ridiculous. But in their minds, people recognize that, and that consistency is totally going to do you some favors. And then there's also the idea of consistency being, having a consistent base, having something that already looks good is going to be 100 million times easier. Maybe not 100 million, but at least 100 times easier for you to adjust as you go. I tend to exaggerate numbers. Anyway, so scale equals consistency, and that is really, really awesome. So has anyone here worked with typographic scales before? A few? Just a little bit? OK. We're going to talk about some math for a second. So typographic scale is really just a ratio. And this one is the golden ratio, which I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of times on the internet, we find out it exists in little dotted lines and triangles in all the logos of all of the world. That may not actually be true. I think that gets added later. It's a bad design joke. Anyways, it's basically a ratio where you take a certain, you multiply the different sizes in your type. So if you start at like 12, you multiply to get the next size up, you multiply by 1.68, and you keep going until you get a list of numbers like this. And maybe this would be in pixels if I was using that scale. I rounded them because decimals and pixels make me feel weird. You could also do the same thing with ems, and it might look like that. Decimals and ems are totally OK. And you would get these numbers from someplace. Well, you could just make them up yourself by doing a little multiplication. But I like to get them from modularscale.com, which is a tool that Tim Brown put together that you can just enter in a couple numbers, hit go, and it'll do all this multiplication for you. It'll give you sizes in pixels, ems, base 16 ems, and percent of 13. The first three are pretty useful. I'm not really sure what percent of 13 is. And these scales can have as much meaning or as little meaning as you want. You've probably read some articles sometimes where people are like, oh, and I picked this scale because it was like based off a major fifth, and this font was designed by Beethoven or something. I made that up and it was horrible. But they have these crazy stories about why they picked this scale. And those are great stories, but that's not an important part of picking a scale. If you pick a typographic scale and you want to use it because you like it and it looks good and it fits what you're trying to do, that's enough reason for me. You don't have to have, you can make up a story like that if you want, but you don't have to have a story like that. And one other thing about scales is that scales are not gospel, basically. You get this list of numbers, and you can use those to assign your different type sizes. Pick your size for your H2s, your H1s, and everything else. But if you're looking at a scale like, oh, apparently I have to go through this way. If you're looking at a scale like this, and you decide like, oh, I decided my H2s were going to be 25 pixels in size, but I'd really like them to be just a little bit smaller, don't throw out your scale. Just set it to like 22 and be fine with it, because you as a human with eyes and a brain are smarter than straight up math anytime when it comes to what looks right and what looks more balanced. So you can always fudge them a little for the human factor. All right, so that's what we can do for consistency. And scales, if you haven't used them, or typographic scales, despite them sounding maybe a little bit weird, are pretty darn awesome to use for that. So what can we do to typeset well when our containers are flexing all over the darn place? Yes. So there's three main things we need to consider when it comes to balancing readable type, or keeping type readable. And if I was like an infomercial right now, I would have like, well, I actually already did have flashbulbs and little explosions, didn't I? Well, I'd have more of those, and I'd probably tell you, like, I could sell you for $9.99 the 3 secrets to like setting type in, well, 3 secrets to setting readable type, but I'm not going to get that crazy with it, because that's sort of silly. But there's 3 things that are kind of considered the, I guess, macro typography or something like that. The 3 things you need to have in balance to keep type readable. The first is size, second is leading, and the third is measure. Those are the super typographic names for them. In CSS, they are font size, line height, and width. Yay! So those 3 things, looking at just those 3 things, you can get stuff looking amazingly readable very easily. When a body of text is hard to read, one of these 3 things is out of whack. So they all are kind of related. And as you kind of adjust them with their fancy little faders, you can pretend that's what we're really doing. If you adjust any one of them, or change any one of them, especially drastically, you need to adjust the other 2 to make something that's still more balanced. And the relationship isn't like a linear mathematical thing. It's not like, well, if you increase measure by 2 pixels, you must increase leading by half a pixel. It's nothing that literal and that linear. It's more just by, when you adjust one, you have to get your balance back. And the goal isn't really like black and white rules of like, this is better. It's more of just a goal of creating something that's in good taste. And we all have pretty good taste. I mean, we're here, right? So we can do that. So also according to Robert Bringhurst, the optimal length, or the most optimal length for a comfortable measure of reading is 45 to 75 characters. You've probably heard that sometimes too. It comes up kind of a lot. That's considered a comfortable measure for reading line length. On the internet, I've noticed that we've kind of changed this a little bit. It's sort of interesting, because I know a lot of you guys probably read sites and then totally go and count the characters per line. But if you did, because if you haven't already, I mean, we tend to go up to around 100 pretty easily, and those sites are actually still pretty easy to read. So 45-ish to 100, or 45 to 75 up to 100. Main point is that it's a range, and we're really dealing with ranges here. There's no, I mean, kind of like what Mike was just saying earlier, it's like there's kind of no absolutes, right? Like pixels are about this close to becoming meaningless right now for web design. So everything is ranges and things that look good within a certain range. Characters per line of what's readable is also a range. So it kind of fits with that a little bit. All right, so what can we do with this information and actually maybe get to some code? Because there has to be code in this talk. So one approach I like to use for keeping line lengths in check is something that I like to call type tweak points. I'm pretty sure I didn't invent that name, but it sounds cool. And basically, it's approach number one for keeping, or my first approach for keeping text comfortably readable, no matter what your containing size might be. And tweak points is a pretty cool term that I first heard from the Sparkbox guys out of Ohio. And I really like the idea of them because it's the idea of like, it's not like your design is broken. It's just like there's these points where things just need a little bit of help. That's kind of more what's going on. So these are actually creating a set of media queries or a set of breakpoints or tweak points, whatever you want to call them, that are type specific. I actually make a whole set just for the type. And I find them, this is crazy, by checking and like actually reading things and checking them on various devices and sizes. For the examples I'm going to show you today, I have a super simple, like stripped down just type example so we can look at the styles that will actually affect that. It's definitely not the most practical, and we're just going to look at it by resizing our browser. But obviously, in the real world, we'd actually look at this on actual device things and that sort of thing. Oh, and I should also point out, actually no, I'll point that out later. So, tweak points. What we do to kind of do this approach. Start with using a scale, using relative units like ems or rems. I'm actually going to use, I'm going to be using rems because I've kind of noticed they got some decent support these days. That's kind of cool, but ems would be pretty much the same situation. When line lengths get too long, according to our 45 to 75 characters-ish, we add a media query, which I have conveniently shortened to MQ. Not sure why, just for fun. And we adjust the base font size based on that new width, and then evaluate the font size and line height from there, just to make sure we have some balance. So that's kind of the trick to it. Oh, and adjust more if needed, of course. There might always be more to adjust. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So here's my super simple example. It's a super simple, type-centric. I keep forgetting there's a screen over there, too. It's in both places. This simple example. And we've just got some text. It's conveniently from Goldilocks, because we're looking for like a nice medium range of things that's good, right? OK, maybe it's not so good. And so it's the breakfast drama of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. So I usually start out with something kind of mobile-y sized, something that's going to look good on the smallest size, kind of phone-sized. Here on the screen, it looks a little tiny, but on the phones, it looks it looks pretty good. So I was pretty happy with that as a starting point. And for my starting point, I had my base font size, as it turns out, set to 75%. And then I assigned all my, in here, my H1s. I have this like lead-in paragraph, and then my body text. That was all set off the scale that I used, the same numbers from the previous example, from the previous scale list, sorry. So I have my original font size, or base font size set to 75%. Oop. And the one other thing I'd point out is that the line height was set to 1.4, which is a unitless measurement. And while we can't do things really in CSS like set a min line height and max line height, this is kind of a close second. So unitless is pretty awesome for these. It'll kind of scale with the font size, as I'm sure you know. And then as in my lead-in paragraph, I set that font size to 1.618. You might remember from our fancy scale, golden ratio, yay. That means it'll be amazing. Bottom margin set from the scale as well, and a line height that's just a little bit smaller, because generally, bigger text, a little less line height is a good idea, and that's going to usually look a little more balanced. And then I had some stuff set for my H1 as well, but I want to get through all these, so. Then usually what I would do is throw in some lorem ipsum, some nice lorem ipsum with a couple little asterisks in there, one at 45 characters in and one at 75 characters in, because I really hate counting, so this is a really good visual way to do it. And it's actually an idea I stole from Trent Walton, who probably also does not like counting, so I think that's why I think he's cool. That might be the only, yeah, because that's one reason to agree with people. I also don't like counting, yay. So we have those in there, and then we basically just start seeing what happens when our when our page gets bigger and our main text container gets bigger and bigger. So eventually we hit a point where we have those two asterisks on one line, and we're like, yeah, this is probably getting a bit too long to read. Yep, you'll notice on the body copy we have that both on one line. It's getting a bit too long to read. Our lead-in paragraph, that's super huge and dynamic, or dramatic rather, it's still doing okay, but our body copy needs some help. So at this point, I put in one of the type tweak points, which is basically setting a media query at approximately 615 pixels and bumping up the font size to 100. And I should probably point out, as I meant to before, but then I stopped myself, is this code is definitely not the kind of code you'd be like copy and paste and use it in your own projects. Write media queries however you would like, use Sass, all that cool stuff, but this is just an easy way to demonstrate it here on our super simple example. So as we keep going, we would make some other changes, maybe decide to add another one in around 850 for this one. I bumped up the font size, and then that font size started looking a little bit big, so I made the line height a little bit smaller as well. And these sorts of things, you can get a whole list of rules of like when line height should be smaller or bigger. Usually like larger text, you want a smaller line height. Text that has lots of space within the letters, you want more line height. But really, the easiest way to do it is to find where things look a little broken, find where your line lengths look a little bit too long, and then start adjusting things and see what looks better to you. Because we're all really good judges of what's easy to read. It's just a matter of taking the time to look at it and adjust things. And if your first adjustment makes it look worse, try going the other way. I think that's the easiest way to learn this stuff and to really get a feel for it. So we kept going, and then in the very end, I ended up setting one for 1200 pixels, and basically, we would end up with something that might look a little like this. Oops, nope, we wouldn't. That's the next point. So the biggest question is, for something simple like this, is where do you stop? And in real life situations, when you're not just mocking up a page about Goldilocks, you're going to run into something other than your text needing to stop getting bigger. Maybe you don't want to be in a situation where your text is this big and you have like this little video or this little image. Like something else in your design will generally stop you and have you have to put in a max width somewhere. And when that happens, then you're good to go. But for this particular one, it was just kind of an arbitrary one where I set my max width of my container at about like 900 pixels or something like that. And these tweak points that you put in for the type don't just have to be adjusting your font size and your line height. I think those are the first two things you should look at to balance out your reading, but you can do more interesting things as well. For example, the new List Apart redesign, they actually switch out to Georgia Pro condensed on their smaller viewport, more mobile-ish views. And if you notice, looking at these a little carefully, because they're very close, the characters on the left-hand one, on the mobile view one, or the smallest one, take up less space than the ones that when they get bigger. So what they've done is switch to a font that's a little more condensed so they can get more characters in on these tiny or thin viewports, but still be able to keep the text bigger. Because a lot of the time, depending on the font you pick, you'll notice when you get down to these smaller viewport sizes, to get a readable length, you start having a really small font size. And then it's like, well, is that really more comfortable? If it's a good, comfortable measure, but it's so tiny, I'm like squinting at my phone, that's not comfortable anymore. So your font choices affect this as well. I think that's a pretty good trick. And you could even maybe do it bigger on the other side. A lot of web type comes as display faces, so you could do something when it gets really big to put in one of the display weights. So then our end thing will look something like this. I'm just going to go through it kind of quick because we have two more. So it starts out small, expands, and gets bigger. We hit our various type tweak points, and then eventually our container stops getting bigger, and we allow our margins to get bigger instead. So that's typographic tweak points, which is a terrible name I've given this approach that definitely is not something I invented, but something that gets used quite a bit. So we start with our scale using relative units. That's the biggest, most important thing. And then we can adjust our base font size to get our scale basically to scale. Ha! And we set a cutoff point based on some other factor, usually than our type. And my end media queries ended up looking like this. So you might have noticed that I switched from pixels to M-based media queries. Usually, since it's pretty easy to get something to tell you how many pixels wide your browser is, not so easy to get something to tell how many M's wide it is, I start with pixels and then convert them over. I like the M-based media queries a lot better because it kind of makes you more resolution independent, right? Like if somebody is viewing, it kind of doesn't matter how many pixels there are anymore. M's, which are essentially roughly based on the 16 pixel increments. If they get bigger because someone zooms in or something, you have fewer M's, and then you might hit one of your other media queries as well. So it really takes you away from pixels and takes you away from that, makes you more resolution independent. Pretty cool way to do it. And Cloud 4 has probably, even though it's a little more than a year old, probably the best reason of why you should move towards those on their blog as well. So to get these particular numbers, I just ended up dividing by 16. But when it comes to the M-based stuff, you kind of end up playing things by ear a little bit more, relying less on actual numbers and actual pixels and just finding those good ranges. So one problem with this approach, though, is that M's don't equal M's anymore. You know, if I have increased my base font size, my M's vertically, yes, I screw that up sometimes. It's very embarrassing. My M's vertically have actually gotten bigger. They're not approximately 16 pixels anymore, right? But my M-based media queries going horizontally are still based off the 16 pixel ratio. They don't get bigger when I increase my base font size. Some people have a really big problem with this. I'm actually kind of okay with it. I don't know if that makes me weird, but I tend to work in really small teams where it's like me and a developer or like me and 3 other people, and there's probably only like 2 of us ever touching the CSS, so we can keep this straight. Bigger teams, maybe that's more of a problem. And really, lately, I've been finding myself playing by ear more when it comes to setting these typographic tweak points of like where I actually change things and relying less on exactly how wide my browser window is and just more on how things look, and maybe I should make a change here or there. So one other approach besides that we can do, Emmify things. That's okay, that was supposed to be a funny title. It's all right. If that title wasn't funny enough for you, I totally have some terrible puns in the subtitle. So if changing, good, okay, yeah. You guys are still awake. You're like, oh, type makes me sleepy. If changing your base font size is a problem, which it often can be, you know, if that making your M's not match is a problem or other reasons is a problem for you, there's other ways to do this as well. And obviously, by keeping things constant, by keeping your base font size constant, your M's will always be approximately based off 16-ish pixels. I like how all the math we're doing now for responsive design is like, approximately, kind of, sort of. It's like we have numbers, and they kind of mean stuff, but they kind of don't. It's pretty cool. It's great when you like to make up numbers. So to kind of take this approach, you want to measure your column widths in M's. And this is maybe the main thing, make it or break it point for people. Not everyone likes to measure their widths in M's. People have grids that work in percentages and all that kind of thing, and they don't want to get away from that. It's OK. You don't have to do it this way, but if you do, this is a good way to do it. You keep your base font size constant, and then you keep your containers fluid when they're smaller, and then when you get to a certain point, which we'll talk about in 1 second, you stop letting anything get bigger, and you just let your margins get bigger, and you base that on an M value. Because generally, kind of, sort of, with our fuzzy math some more, if there's any like super math people in the house, they're probably starting to feel like a little icky. But 1M is approximately, like 1M, at least typographically, is based off of a capital M, which is approximately 2-ish characters for most fonts. So if we say 75 characters is our maximum comfortable reading measure, and we divide that approximately by 2, somewhere in around 32 M should be the max size of our main text container. And if it never goes over 32 M's, we'll never have more than 75 characters, and we will always be at a comfortable readable length. Yay, math. So we would end up with something like this, where when it's very small, we keep it nice and flexible. Oops, sorry. When we get to more medium length, we're still a little flexible, but at some point in that sort of medium range, we hit our maximum 32 M's. And then when we do that, things get a little bit bigger, but only our margins get bigger. And as we get bigger and bigger, our margins get huger and huger. If this were a real project and not Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, we might, kick up to 2 columns or something like that. But in this case, it just hangs out there in the center all by its lonely self. And our font sizes never actually change. So that's another approach, keeping your line length in a comfortable way, but without having to making fewer tweaks. So widths and everything in M's keeps you nice and resolution independent. That is pretty awesome. There's still an option to make adjustments here or there. You can make more adjustments if you want to and make those little tweak points in addition to doing this one. And it doesn't work well with all grid making approaches. I know some people who are like the idea of setting up their grids in M's, and they just kind of like freak out and don't want to talk to me anymore. So it's OK. I mean, I'll get over it. I'll just do the other version instead. I end up having to work with a lot of different teams, so I'm used to adapting. So one more approach, since we said we do 3. And I realize I have no idea how I'm doing on time because my counter didn't start, so I'm sorry about that. One other approach that I've been playing with a little bit and haven't really gotten to use for real yet is VH and VW. VH is my favorite, obviously. Get it? Val head VH, OK, yeah. I'm like, that's awesome, I have a unit named after me. Oh. These don't really have enough support to use anywhere real just yet, but they're really interesting. 100 VW equals all of the viewport width, essentially. So 1 is like 1%. And you can set up something that will constantly change the font size, and even like your margins and line height and everything you want in all directions based on your viewport, and it just changes all the time. Well, except most browsers make you refresh before it updates, but once they fix that, all the time, squishy, it's great. But it's kind of drastic. For example, these two are both set to 2 VW for font size. This one, you're never going to be able to read, even if that was on a real phone. Not going to happen. It's way too tiny. So it kind of scales to any proportion at all, and when it gets really big, you know, it kind of looks okay, but it doesn't handle small sizes well. But I do like what it's doing to my heading. I mean, that's kind of cool. It's a little small on the small end too, but it's maybe a little bit more of a headings thing. So these guys are definitely fun, because squishing things in all directions and making your margins change and your font size change is really fun to do. But it still needs limits somewhere, probably especially on the low end, because that text was so tiny. I don't even know if like a magnifying glass would help you out with that. It was pretty bad. And it's pretty kick-ass for titles and display copy. I think that's the kind of place these are really going to come in handy. Places where you might have used something like fit text and used JavaScript to make sure it always made your text size big enough to fill your whole window, you might be able to use these instead. Kind of nice. OK, so responsive design, strangely enough, is more than just making your boxes all flexy. So typography for responsive design is also more than just fitting them into flexy containers. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we can do to make, what we can do with our type to make it, I guess, basically more aware that we're under different conditions, not just in flexy boxes. And I realize I've been doing this like all day. Like, yay, this is my new dance. Anyways, so things we can do with type that consider devices at least just a little. Because we don't have any real reliable way still to really find out like what someone's connection speed or anything is, but we can kind of make some assumptions, and I'll go with the assumptions for now until we have something better. So loading web fonts can take a while. It can take a really long while. You especially notice it on mobile situations where, generally speaking, your connection might be a bit slower, for lack of a better way to measure, and you know, you're going to see that you'll actually notice this loading thing happen. So there's a couple things we can do to make this happen more gracefully. We can use font stacks still. I know things like services like Typekit and FontDeck and everything, they give you the CSS samples, and it's usually like your awesome web type and then like serif. There should always be something between your awesome web type and serif, always. You know, don't just copy and paste that. Because sometimes, this is a little sad and terrible, sometimes your web fonts won't load at all. Don't want to scare anyone, but it's true. And not just in mobile situations. There's actually like, you know, ad blockers and stuff that will block things like Typekit, and then suddenly you're on your fallback font, so they better be awesome. This is a chart that is scary but true, and it goes to try to show you what font exists on all mobile platforms. None. Good luck with that. So basically, at some point, no matter what, on some devices, you're going to be stuck with your basic serif or sans serif. It is also possible to hide web fonts from mobile situations if you want to. If you're OK with basing thin, viewport means probably mobile, maybe not really good connection speed. We can do things like actually by not calling our awesome web font, it won't get loaded. But that's only if you actually load in your web font through pure CSS. A little trickier if you're using JavaScript, but you know, JavaScript can handle that whole like if this then that stuff too. I've heard of people taking some approaches of creating like a light type kit and a heavy type kit. One with fewer fonts, one with more, serving the lighter one to mobile. And this is a great article, since I don't have any time to get into it, but CSS Tricks did some great things and examples about preventing the performance hit of custom fonts. There are also web font events that we can look into, and they are seriously awesome. Google has put these together, and you can actually use the Google Web Font Loader to get events of the situation of your web fonts loading with any service or situation for loading web fonts that you want. It comes built into Typekit, but you can set up this Google one even if you're rolling your own at font face setup. The way it works, you get some classes, one for when your web fonts are loading, called WF loading. The naming structure is amazing. Obviously, when they're inactive means they haven't loaded at all, and when they're active, and you can set some different styles based on that. And this comes in handy especially for titles or really important text like taglines or something like that, where you want to really handle every detail of how it's going to get swapped out from its default font or the fallback font, then what it gets swapped out with once your web fonts load. So you can control every step of the way on this and make sure that like when it's just set to plain old serif, it still fits in the same box it's going to fit in when you're using your good Proxima Nova or whatever else. So those are pretty handy. Whew. I've been going through a whole lot of stuff. So the very last part that I want to talk about, because I'm assuming I only have a couple minutes left, is responsive typography for the future. I mean, there's a lot more we can do with type and fonts than just fitting them into flexi boxes and trying to figure out if we have a good connection speed or not to load our stuff and handling that loading function. One thing that's really interesting, and I didn't talk about it too much, is just the idea that on Retina displays, your fonts look different. We've all seen it. We've got, you know, high-resolution phones or high-density phones, or whatever you want to call them, Retina display phones, and then regular old monitors. And on Retina displays, your type is going to appear lighter, even though it's not lighter, basically because it's higher resolution. So the folks over who make IA Writer have actually done some things, or done some experimenting with graded fonts. And basically, these fonts are aware of, you know, what your resolution that they're dealing with is. And they actually would serve up a slightly bolder version to Retina displays so that it ends up looking exactly the same as the coarser, lower resolution version. So it's like a font that knows what resolution it's being displayed at and adjusts itself accordingly. That would be pretty cool to play with, I think. So that's one way that things could be getting pretty interesting. Another way things could be getting pretty interesting is I believe this is a series actually that Nick has been writing on a list apart. But he's suggesting that you know, all fonts have some hinting included with them, and that's basically instructions of how to make their awesome smooth curves translate to coarse, harsh pixels, and how that's going to happen. And hinting tells them how to do that. But he's suggesting that maybe hinting could do more than that. Like, what if the hinting instructions of your font could tell it, hey, skinny viewport, maybe condense your characters a little bit, give me like a condensed version, or like, hey, really, really big viewport, why don't we go with the more wide version? So that kind of things, those kinds of things could be actually embedded within our fonts, and our fonts could be smart enough. You know, we wouldn't have to swap them out ourselves, they could actually know. And I think that's kind of cool. The idea of like, pulling up a web font and loading it up and having it know like the resolution and adjusting for that, knowing what kind of viewport size I'm dealing with, smart fonts sound pretty awesome. So the whole idea of responsive and typography, I think, is heading to some pretty interesting directions. And I'm kind of excited about all this stuff. And hopefully maybe you guys are a little bit too. So that wraps up our journey of typography for responsive design. It's a lot to cover in like 30 minutes, so thanks for following along. Yeah, thanks for having me and talking about responsive typography for a little while. I know that we're having a party on the beach later, and there's probably nothing more fun than talking about typography on the beach, right? So if you guys want to chat later about any type stuff, let me know. If you want to chat on the internet, that's where to find me. And thanks very much.